Hi everyone, it's me. Welcome to today's video. We are going to be talking about all things duologies today. So we are going to go through every single duology that I have completed that are finished, and I have read both of them. We're going to go through all of those in order from worst to best. That's basically going to be it for today. I feel like duologies are underrated and overrated at the same time. Like, there are those of us that really appreciate and respect a duology, but I also think they don't get talked about nearly enough. I feel like we always talk about either standalones or trilogies or longer series in terms of like dedicated video content, but we need to share some love for the duologies out there, because I honestly think a duology can be the absolute perfect length, or like the amount of books that you can spend in one world. Because sometimes like standalones are great, but sometimes after you read a standalone, and if you really love that world and those characters, you just want a little bit more. And then sometimes, let's say with a trilogy or a longer series, you tend to always experience that dreaded phenomenon that is called second book syndrome, where a book in a series just really truly feels like filler and like it didn't really have to be there. The duology format tends to help you steer away from that kind of naturally. So let's talk about duologies. Behind me here, I do have some piles of duologies that I have read in the past, let's say 5 years, ranked from worst to best in my humble opinion, starting with last place. This is 14th place. We have It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Now, I feel like I don't really need to go over this book or the plot synopsis, because I feel like everyone at this point has read this book, or you at least know of someone who has read this book and you know about it, or you've watched the movie. But essentially, we follow our female protagonist as she goes through a romance or a couple of romances and navigates trying to break the cycle of domestic abuse, because she grew up in a home where her father was very abusive to her mom, and she's just, as she's coming of age, as she's growing up, she wants to break out of that cycle, which I think definitely has the potential to make a very impactful story. And I will say, when I did read It Ends With Us, I cried. Like, it did get me emotionally. I think the themes that are explored in this book are definitely very hard-hitting. I think it would be very tough not to get emotional over a story like this. But I will also say, as I was reading through this first book, I was definitely cringing at a lot of the dialogue that was in this book. I think at this point, I hadn't read very much adult romance. I had read a lot of YA romance. As a teenager, you know, I read things like Nicholas Sparks books. I read a lot of John Green books. I went through that phase. But in terms of adult romance, I hadn't really experienced it so much. So Colleen Hoover was really my, my entry into adult romance, which I think happened to a lot of us. But I think already immediately, even though this was one of my first adult romance books, I was just feeling very uncomfortable with some of the way the dialogue was written and also the actions of our characters. I just was not a fan. I was not feeling it so much. So the first book, I think, was just kind of okay for me. I had no real, I had nothing else to really compare it to. And this book was actually always supposed to be a standalone, but then It Starts With Us came out. Surprise, because I think It Ends With Us did so well. Colleen Hoover and her publishers were just like, hey, let's release a sequel and make it a duology. And this sequel, I did read it because, I don't know, I just was so curious about it. It did not have to exist. It truly did not have to exist. The sequel just felt like one long epilogue, and if you know me, you know that even in a regular romance epilogue, I get bored. I tend to lose interest once a romance epilogue begins, and usually that's, just one chapter at the end of the book. So the fact that we have an entire book that is basically an epilogue to It Ends With Us, it just felt like a very nothing book to me. I feel like it did not give us anything that we hadn't already learned or experienced in the first book. It just didn't have to be there. So because of multiple reasons, this is my lowest ranked duology. All right, in next place, this one may be a little bit upsetting for you guys, so I apologize if it is. Reading is subjective. If you guys loved these books, I am so happy for you. They just did not work for me. So The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. This is part of the larger Crowns of Nyaxia series, but the way the series is formatted, each kind of little section is split up into its own little duology. So this is like a little duology within a larger series. So we have The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and the second book is called The Ashes and the Star Cursed King. I believe, something like that. There's a lot of words to these titles, but this is a romantasy duology. We are set in a world where we have vampires. Our protagonist Aurea enters into this competition because the winner of this competition gets like one wish that is granted by the gods of this world. And I think her father wanted her to join this competition so she could like bond with his power or something. I don't know. I read this book quite a few years ago, so the main plot points are a little bit fuzzy to me at this point, but she joins, realizes that the competition is going to be very difficult for her because she currently has no power. She's not a vampire, but basically everyone else who has joined this competition is a vampire, has powers, is way stronger than her and more experienced. So she has to ally with this mysterious broody guy named Rain, I think, to get through this competition. Now, I will say I enjoyed the first book. I think it was really fun. This is also, I would say, one of the first romantasies that I read. I think my first true romantasy that I read, like adult romantasy, was Fourth Wing, and I read this one shortly after because I was seeing a lot of those like, if you loved Fourth Wing, read this, and so I picked this one up. And yeah, I will say the first book was fun. I personally don't think it was anything too unique, and I was already sensing that in that era where I was just getting into romantasy, but I do think the first book was fun. It really truly felt like Hunger Games, but you know, a little bit more spicy. What really brought this duology down for me was the second book. I actually remember reading the second book during my honeymoon, actually, when I went to Hungary, and I remember it taking so much time to get through the sequel. Number one, because I was on my honeymoon, so I was, you know, out and about doing things, but I was taking some time to read. Like, we went on a lot of trains, going from like city to city in Hungary, and during, you know, travel back and forth, I was reading a lot. But I just remember being so bored while reading the second book. I think a lot of the characters really started not acting like themselves in the second book. I think Carissa Broadbent was trying to give you this situation where our characters were enemies again, but sometimes I feel like when enemies become lovers, it's difficult to make them enemies again. Like, you really have to have a good reason why. And I guess there was a reason why in the sequel, but just the way our characters were acting really felt inconsistent to what we had learned from them in the first book. And one of my biggest pet peeves in sequels is when characters take 10 steps backwards from all the progress and character development that we made in the first book. I just feel like that really happened. The story also didn't really make sense to me, to be honest, and so I didn't love it. I would still, you know what, I would still recommend the first book as a standalone. Even though it will leave you with a lot of untied ends, I think the first book was very enjoyable to read. The second book just truly brought it down for me. Just a little step higher is actually, this one kind of makes me sad. The Stolen Heir duology by Holly Black. This is a spin-off duology to the Cruel Prince trilogy, and this one follows the brother of the protagonist of The Cruel Prince. We basically just have a very whimsical, fun fairy world here, and it's honestly a little bit hard for me to give you a synopsis about this book without also going into The Cruel Prince, I feel like, because it is so closely tied to The Cruel Prince as a spin-off. But we follow Oak. He is a little fairy child. I mean, he was a little kid in The Cruel Prince, but in this one he's grown up to be a young adult, and he's the son of this really strong but kind of evil and menacing general. But Oak has kind of grown up to be this rebellious teenager, kind of. Like, he doesn't really take much seriously, but he actually needs to seek the help of Surin, who is someone he knew as a child, but she's actually fled to the human world and is kind of hiding out in the human world. So we follow these two characters as they reunite, reconnect, and then go on this big quest, essentially. I just found the direction and the vibe of this book to be very confusing. It didn't really know what it wanted to be, I think, because coming from the Cruel Prince trilogy, we have a world that is very fairy, very folklore, and that trilogy was definitely very like political fairy fantasy, I would say. There was a lot to do with court, politics, all of that good stuff. This one tried to be an adventure book that was set in a world that was built up to be a court politics fairy book, and so I think that felt very confusing first and foremost. But similar to Serpent and the Wings of the Night, I didn't hate this first book. I actually had some fun with it. I enjoyed the quest adventure vibes, but again, the second book kind of brought me down because I think what happened, from what I heard, from little rumors I've heard online, is that the reaction to this book was not overly positive because it did feel so different to The Cruel Prince. And so with the second book, The Prisoner's Throne, I think Holly Black really tried to make it feel more like The Cruel Prince, like made it more of that court politics type of a story. And because she did such a tone shift, again, after writing this adventure book, it became even more confusing. It was like, are you trying to be a court politics book or are you trying to be a quest adventure book? And I was just very confused at it all. The best parts about these books were honestly the callbacks to some of the main characters in The Cruel Prince. It was one of those things like when you see your favorite characters, you get happy to see them again, see how they're doing. But outside of that, I didn't have too much that I loved about this duology in general. So unfortunately, was not my favorite. Moving on to our next one, I have The Tales of the Celestial Kingdom / The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Lynn Tan. So this is the first book. The second book is The Heart of the Sun Warrior, and this is another romantasy. This one is very much YA, and it is heavily based in Chinese or Asian mythology, which I absolutely love. I had really high hopes for this duology, and I did not hate it. There was a lot that I loved about these books, but in this one we follow Xing Yin, who is the daughter of the moon goddess. That's the title of the book. Love when that happens. So at the beginning of the story, her and her mother, they just stick to the moon palace in their kingdom. However, an incident occurs and Xing Yin realizes that her mother has been keeping her a secret from the celestial kingdom for a number of reasons. Xing Yin has been detected in their home because of a flare-up in her magic that she accidentally kind of let out. So she is forced to flee her home. She actually ends up living very close to the celestial royal family, the very people she is trying to run away from, and she kind of has to live undercover as she gets forced to interact, get more interconnected with this royal family. And the story goes from there. There's dragons, there's mythology, there's a lot of great stuff in here, and the writing in these books is absolutely beautiful. It is the type of descriptive writing style that I absolutely love. But what I didn't love about these books was, first of all, the love triangle. There is a love triangle in these books, and I think just the way it was done was very drawn out. It also felt very YA. The way every single character that was involved in this love triangle was treating each other made me really lose respect for each character as well. They were kind of all like very disrespectful to themselves and also each other throughout the entire process. So the romance in these books I really disliked. But I remember being very impressed at how much plot was stuffed into this first book. I think the story was very impressive, seeing as this was a YA book and honestly not too long. The plot was very fast-paced, a lot more intricate than I had expected, and we had a lot of fun politics in there as well. So overall, I did have good first impressions about the first book outside of the romance, but again, the second book brought me down. A lot of these duologies that I disliked, it's all about the second books that brought me down. I think the second book just lacked purpose and direction. The second book truly felt like just a whole bunch of disconnected, jumbled side quests to me. I didn't really see what our main goal was, and so I did not love the second book. I will say though, this book is one that you could probably just read the first book and get away with it. There is quite a satisfying ending to the first book, and we don't really have, like, we have loose ends, but not so many loose ends that you're like, oh my gosh, I need to dive into the second book immediately to see what happens. I think the first book actually does conclude itself very well, wraps up most things, like wraps up 99% of what you would want wrapped up, and I think you'd be more than okay to just read the first book as a standalone and not go on to the second if you don't desire to, because yeah, the second book is where I was truly disappointed. But that is Daughter of the Moon Goddess. It was very beautifully written, and I do absolutely want to dive into more of Lynn Tan's books. I just didn't love the sequel. Next up, this one was actually quite a fun one for me to read. So we are transitioning into duologies that I, actually really enjoyed. What the River Knows by Isabel Ibanez. This one is another YA romantasy duology, but this one has such a fun vibe. Our protagonist Inez is living in Argentina, I believe, and her parents have always been really interested in excavations, digging up old relics, old artifacts from like the age of Cleopatra in Egypt. But unfortunately, at the beginning of the story, Inez finds out that her parents have gone missing, have passed away during an excavation that they were on in Egypt. So Inez decides, hey, I'm gonna go to Egypt, find out what really happened to them, because everything just seems very mysterious. The dots aren't really connecting. So she heads over to Egypt and decides to try and track down her her parents' last footsteps to see what really happened to them. And so along the way, she obviously goes on a lot of these excavations on her own, and this story is just so much fun. My biggest complaints about the first book were the vibe didn't really feel like a period piece. We are supposed to be set in the 1800s in this book, and although I felt the Egypt atmosphere, I wasn't really feeling the period atmosphere, and I really wanted to feel like I was being whisked in time to that era. That did improve in the second book. So I think this is actually a case of a duology where the second book was better than the first, which I always prefer. We had just such a fun, refreshing story in this one. It felt a little bit different from a lot of other romantic duologies that I've read because our love interest was actually not a shadow daddy. Our female protagonist was also not this very sassy, combat trained, like assassin type character. She just seemed like a really regular girl who was interested in history and wanted to find out what happened to her parents. So the dynamic between our two main characters was just very, very nice to read. Something a little bit different than what we normally experience in a romantasy these days. And I just found the excavations and the environment to be really fun to be in. The magic in this world is not like overly present. We are dealing with just regular old humans in this book, but the magic comes in the form of the old relics and artifacts that we are digging up. Like these old objects hold magic from, you know, previous days where magic used to be more potent in the world. I found this one to be a lot of fun. I definitely would recommend. There are some bizarre things that happen that are just kind of really out of the blue, and also the romance does feel a little bit random in terms of how it was built up, I think, in this duology, but outside of that, it's just a really fun plot, so would recommend. Okay, next up, Six Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. This is a duology, but it also has a prequel, so it's kind of a trilogy now, but it's officially a duology with a prequel. I loved this one. The first book. I loved the first book. But this is a YA fantasy duology. We follow Shiori, who is the only princess of Kiata. She has 6 brothers, but she's the only like daughter in their royal family. She is forced into this engagement with a prince from a faraway kingdom for political reasons, but she is not having it. She does not want to be a part of this engagement, so she kind of acts out and she loses control of her magic. In this incident, her kind of evil stepmother notices and ends up banishing her. She also places a curse on her brothers where her brothers just turn into cranes, and Shiori actually loses her voice, so she can no longer speak. And so we go on this story where she tries to navigate, you know, her life, find somewhere to belong, and also to help save her brothers because they are now cranes. This book was a 5-star, this first book. I absolutely adored it. It was so wonderful. It actually pulled me out of a reading slump that I was in at the time when I was reading it. It was just so magical, so wonderful. It felt like a fairy tale. And I think this duology is very heavily based on fairy tale and mythology, so I really, really got those vibes. It was absolutely wonderful. Would highly recommend the first book. I just did not love the sequel, and I honestly didn't love the prequel as much either. The sequel, A Dragon's Promise, was the most disappointing for me in this world. Honestly, kind of similar to the sequel of The Daughter of the Moon Goddess. It felt like a whole bunch of disjointed side quests and really just made me lose interest. I think the sequel and the prequel also have a lot more combat in general in them, like combat sequences and combat scenes, which I honestly don't think is Elizabeth Lim's strength. What I loved about Six Crimson Cranes is that we followed a protagonist that was very different. She didn't fight. She didn't participate in a lot of action moments. She used her strengths in different areas to fight for her brothers, to get them back, to find her voice and strength in a different way. And that's what I loved about Six Crimson Cranes, but the other 2 books really took a different direction. We're a lot more questy, combat-y, and you know, I don't hate quest combat-y books. There are so many quest combat-y books that I absolutely love, but in terms of the way Elizabeth Lim writes, I think her strengths really just shone very, very brightly in Six Crimson Cranes. So I think this is actually another case of a duology where you could happily just read the first book and leave it there because it does conclude itself very, very well. And I would maybe, honestly, just very highly recommend that. Obviously, you can go on and read the rest of the books if you enjoy the world and really love it. You may love the sequel and prequel more than I did, but the first book was where it was at for me. This next one's a little bit random, honestly. The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. I think this duology is actually called the DNA Duo or something like that. But we have this book and we also have the True Love Experiment. This is sort of, you could call it one of those interconnected romance series where they're just kind of loosely connected. Each one follows a different couple. But I think these ones are just more interconnected than other ones. But the whole premise of this one is that we have this dating app and it basically takes your DNA and matches you to someone else who has compatible DNA with you. Like, it's a little bit of a bizarre concept, but you can basically find your perfect match. Like anyone you match it with, you can see the percentage of like how much you would get along with them. And so we follow our protagonist Jessica. She's some sort of like a stats whiz, like a data whiz. She loves crunching numbers and her best friend kind of convinces her to join this app. But Jessica is very skeptical about this because she's very much like a sciencey person. She's like, this doesn't really make sense, until she gets a 98% match with the founder of this DNA matching app. And so we go on with this romance. The second book follows her best friend and has more of like a reality show vibe, but I don't know. I read these ones so long ago, so I don't really have too much to say about these. I remember really enjoying this first one actually when I read it years and years and years ago, but the second one I feel like was not as strong, and I honestly don't remember why. But we're just gonna leave this one there. I don't know. If you want to pick up an interconnected romance duology, maybe check these ones out if that premise entices you. All right. King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. This is a duology set in the larger Grishaverse universe. I've talked so much about this universe, but this one is set at the end of the Grishaverse, so I would highly not recommend reading this one as your first Grishaverse novel. Definitely start with Shadow and Bone, then go on to Six of Crows, and then go on to this one, because we basically just follow some of our favorite characters that appear in the other Grishaverse novels as they kind of take their own stories in this duology. The Grishaverse in general is a very, very fun world where, I don't know, it's so like, it expands so far. I don't even know where to start with it. But let's say in Shadow and Bone, in the first book in the Grishaverse, we have a country that is torn into two by this shadow fold, which is this very dangerous area. It's like all dark and it has creatures and everything. It's been created by this very, very evil magical entity that has shadow powers. And we follow Alina, who is an orphan, and her best friend Mal from the orphanage as they venture into this dangerous realm. There's politics, there's like fantasy warfare, there's elemental magic, there are saints. There's just a lot to this world. But yeah, this is, as of right now, the latest and greatest installment in the Grishaverse. I overall enjoy this duology. I just love reading anything in this universe, to be honest. But I will say, I think in terms of all the other Grishaverse series, this duology was the loosest for me in terms of how everything tied together, which is very surprising because this duology actually follows some of my absolute favorite characters in the Grishaverse, and I absolutely love just reading about them. But in terms of the story and the pacing, I think those were a little bit weak in this duology compared to the other Grishaverse novels. Definitely check this duology out if you have read other Grishaverse books and you love Nina, if you love Nikolai, if you love Zoya, and you haven't checked this one out yet, you definitely should, just to expand your Grishaverse lore. Okay, we have Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. This is a fun YA romantasy, although I would call this upper YA for sure. We basically follow a witch and a witch hunter. We have a cat and mouse little situation going on, and that's kind of all you need to know diving into this one. I found this first book to be so addicting. I read it during a 24-hour readathon and I just blasted right through it. So quick, so easy to read. I actually really loved the cat and mouse dynamic in this one. I think it was done very, very well. And although there were a few little plot holes, I had the time of my life reading this, so I really had not too much to complain about. The second one, however, Rebel Witch, was a little bit disappointing for me. I think I was really invested in how like the witch magic worked in this world, and we kind of touched on it just a little bit in the first book. The fantasy world is very simple here. The magic system, very simple, very easy to grasp, which is expected for a romantasy, but I wanted to just get into it a little bit more in the second book, and we really did not get a lot more expansion on the world, the magic, or anything really in the second book. I think for me, the second book was very much like if you just really loved the two main characters and wanted more of them, you would have loved the second book. But I just don't think there was much difference in the plot. There wasn't much difference, honestly, between the dynamic of our two main characters. I was honestly very frustrated how we were just getting into almost the exact same cat and mouse dynamic that we saw in the first book. We were just getting rinse and repeat of that in the second book, in my opinion, and I wanted to learn more about the magic. I wanted to see more. I wanted to see more spells. You know, even if we don't expand into a very complicated magic system, I wanted to see our witch doing more like different spells. She's supposed to be known as this very high profile, very strong witch, and we only really saw her cast like 2 different spells throughout this entire duology, and I was just very confused at that. I wanted to see more. So while the second book was disappointing to me, I still just do have very, very fond memories of this duology as a whole, mostly because I enjoyed the first book so much, and although I didn't love the second book, it still was very easy to read. It still was very fun. That is Heartless Hunter / the Crimson Moth duology. We're getting into our top 5. So in 5th place, I actually have the Dance of Thieves duology. I am holding up Vow of Thieves in place of Dance of Thieves because I don't have the first book in physical, but this is such a fun duology. We follow a thief. I forget her name actually. What is her name? Cassie. We follow Cassie. And so she's a thief. She currently is working for the queen of her kingdom. In a rival kingdom, the king, I believe, has just passed away, and so the throne has been inherited by his heir, Jace. Cassie is sent sort of as like an ambassador, as a spy almost, to go over to this neighboring kingdom and basically just like make sure Jace is doing things like all in line. He's not kind of messing things up. There's a bunch of peace treaties, like territory, land treaties, and stuff that are set in place between these two kingdoms, and she's just there to check everything out, to make sure everything's okay. As she arrived, she gets to know Jace, and they sort of get, I don't know, forced into this situation where they have to basically spend the whole book together. And that's all I'll tell you about that. I really, really love this duology. I honestly think the first book was kind of average for me, but the second book is where this duology, you know, really, really convinced me. I was just very impressed at the amount of politics in this romantasy duology. We actually explored a lot with the land territory stuff, like more than I expected. And when I say we discussed land territory, I feel like that sounds kind of boring, but trust me, it was not in a boring way. It was very much in an exciting way. We also learned a lot more about kind of like the ancestors of our families that we were following in this book. And I just had a lot of fun reading this one. I was so attached to so many of the characters by the end of this duology. It's one of those books where you get to know a family and then you just get so attached to the family, seeing all like the sibling dynamics and how they interact with one another, and you just end up caring so deeply for everyone involved. I would highly recommend this. I know this one is actually a spin-off to another trilogy. I haven't read that trilogy yet, but I've heard that this duology is even better if you have read that trilogy first, so there's that to take into account. But even just stepping into this duology without having the previous knowledge of the other books, I still really, really enjoyed it. I also think that if you're looking for a fantasy romance that is political but also easy to understand, this one is a good one to pick up. The magic in this one also is not very complex. There's actually not too much magic involved. It's one of those stories where our characters are like not overly magical or magical at all really, but we are just kind of more set in this magical world with magical things around you, like magical beings, magical creatures, stuff like that. We're getting into Rebecca Ross as we enter into our top 4. So, A River Enchanted / The Elements of Cadence duology by Rebecca Ross. This is such an atmospheric fantasy duology. I loved this so much. We have lots of like elemental weather kind of spirits in this one, but basically we follow Jack. He is from this mystical magical island, but he has traveled over to the mainland to study music, and he's been off the island for I think like 10 years or like a very long time. At the beginning of the book, he receives a letter, he receives a summons to come back to the island because these young girls have started to go missing on the island, and so they want him to come back and help because they believe him him and his magical ability will be useful in trying to solve what has happened and to try and find these missing girls. So he goes back, and yeah, we just venture into this story that is filled with elemental spirits, with this very, very magical environment that has a character on its own. And also just the inclusion of music in this magic system was so, so, so wonderful. I feel like Rebecca Ross does that a lot. She definitely loves tying in music with magic, and I am not complaining. I absolutely love that. But this duology is absolutely wonderful. It is a bit slower paced. It's one of those books where you just want to like settle in, get fully immersed, take your time with it, and just be transported into this whole other world that just feels so thick and so full. This also, compared to her more popular Divine Rivals duology, which we're going to talk about in a sec, also just has a lot more magic in it. So if you loved the Divine Rivals duology and loved how it was written, but are just craving a little bit more magic, I would highly recommend this one. And speaking of Divine Rivals, getting into our third place, we actually have Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. So this is a duology. It does now have a prequel attached, but the duology itself is Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows. And this is another fantasy romance. I love this duology. This one, as I was mentioning, doesn't have too much magic in it, so it reads more like a historical romance, but with like a few elements of fantasy. But we follow Iris and Roman, who are rivals. They're kind of workplace rivals. They both work as journalists. They're just constantly competing against each other for, like, you know, the articles, the topics that they want to write about. And they're also actually magically connected through typewriter. So there's lots of letter writing back and forth. We are set in a war-torn land, and so we follow our characters as they head out onto the front lines of the war to be journalists and write about what's going on. And it's just such a lovely, lovely story. The writing is beautiful. The letter writing is wonderful, and I loved both books in this duology so, so, so dearly. Would highly recommend if you still have not jumped into this world. And yeah, now there's also a prequel that is loosely attached to the story. It is set in the same world. It is called Wild Reverence, and it is actually my favorite read of all time from Rebecca Ross. So absolutely loved this one. All right, we're getting into our top two. These were actually really difficult to rank. They could be interchangeable depending on what day you ask me what my favorite duology is, but in second place for today, One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. So we have this one, and we have Two Twisted Crowns, and this is a gothic fantasy duology. This is one of the most unique magic systems I have ever read. We have a magic system that is based on cards. So each card has a different ability on it. To use the ability, you basically touch the card, and then you have the ability, and to release it, you touch the card again. Every time you touch the card though, you kind of have to give something, because magic has to stay in balance, so you can't just use magic and not sacrifice anything. So the more prolonged use and the more you use a card, the more negative effects you will feel. The world is also so, so delicious and just like atmospheric. We are set in this really, really misty world where if you go out into the mists, you will contract an illness and kind of develop like your own magical powers. The higher ups in this world clearly don't want that. They want to control the way magic is used through these cards that exist, and they don't want anyone to have magic outside of these cards. We have these physicians that go around and check children, because children are the most susceptible to these mists, just to make sure they haven't fallen ill, they haven't contracted these magical powers. And if they do find children who have magical powers, they get rid of them. So we follow Elspeth, who did, you know, fall ill and who did acquire a magical power as a child, but she's been successfully hiding it throughout her entire life. Elspeth's power has actually manifested in the form of a monster who lives in her head called the Nightmare. But the story begins as she meets a mysterious highwayman on the road and put into these situations where she risks getting revealed. I absolutely love this duology so, so, so much. The way it was written, the way the tarot card magic system was set up, the way there's literal cards throughout the book as you're reading it. I honestly want to reread this book very, very badly, or this duology in general. I loved it so much. And if you're looking for something very moody and atmospheric to read this fall, this is the perfect fall read, I would say. And then in first place, we have Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Yes, I do despise the covers. that I have. I do not like that my editions of these books look like this, but we did talk about the Grishaverse a little bit earlier on when we spoke about King of Scars. This is Six of Crows. It is the duology that happens just before King of Scars, but in this one we have very much a heist story. We follow a group of miscellaneous kind of like ragtag characters who have been forced together to pull off this very, very impossible heist, and we just follow them as they get to know each other more, and it is just so wonderfully done. The way all of the pieces fall into place at the end of these books are very, very satisfying because we follow 6 different POVs of the 6 different crows in these books. It's one of those books that like you never get the full picture until the very end of the book because you only get little pieces of what each character is doing with their kind of like just one task at mind, and no one really knows the full picture of everything that will happen except for maybe one character. But as a reader, you don't know. And then it's only at the end when you see everything kind of like fall into place, when all the pieces settle, that you're like, oh, that's what we were doing this whole time. And it's just so satisfying and so fun. The characters and the found family in this duology is, you know, one of the best. And I will say, I think this duology has grown on me over time because this was actually the first book that I picked up in the Grishaverse, which is completely wrong. I definitely should have picked up Shadow and Bone first, but even just picking up this duology, I still rated the books like 5 and 4.5, I'm pretty sure. So very, very high ratings. But then as I went on and read more in the Grishaverse and started seeing more connections to things, this duology has just grown on me. Like just seeing everything else around it that happens and seeing where it sits and getting more of a view on the world. I actually just recently reread a little bit of Six of Crows and just seeing how much harder it hit, knowing more of the lore of the Grishaverse in general was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. So I definitely want to reread this entire duology as a whole at some point, but yeah, an absolute masterpiece. But that being said, those are all the duologies that I have read in, let's say, the past 5 years, ranked from worst to best. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment. If you don't know what to comment down below, let me know what is your least favorite duology and what is your favorite duology. If you like me, subscribe, do that bell thing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!